There is a video file that runs for exactly 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, a shape moves through a stand of pale birch trees on a hillside in the Pacific Northwest. And for the last 40 years, people have argued about whether that shape is a man in a costume, a bear standing wrong, or something that science has refused to name. That single clip has been enhanced, slowed, reversed, stabilized, and picked apart pixel by pixel by more people than have ever watched most feature films. And every one of them brought something to it. Belief, doubt, a camp they were already loyal to. Nobody who has ever looked at that footage looked at it with empty hands. So a team of researchers decided to try something no eyewitness could ever do. They decided to remove the human being from the middle of the question entirely. They gathered not one clip, not one blurry frame, but every documented Bigfoot sighting they could recover from the last 66 years, thousands upon thousands of reports, stretching back to 1958, the year the word itself was printed in a newspaper for the first time. And instead of asking a person what it all meant, they fed the entire archive into an artificial intelligence. A system with no childhood campfire stories, no favorite documentary, no reputation to protect, an algorithm that does not believe in monsters and does not need them to be real. They expected the machine to find nothing. They expected noise. What it found instead was a pattern, specific, repeating, and, by the team's own private admission, deeply difficult to explain away. This is the story of what an unbiased machine saw when it looked at everything at once. And by the end, the question is not going to be whether you believe in a creature. The question is going to be why the data has a shape at all. To understand why this analysis mattered, you have to understand the problem it was built to solve. For more than half a century, the study of this particular legend has been trapped in a loop. Someone sees something in the woods. They report it or they don't. If they do, the report enters a strange gray zone, too vague to prove, too consistent to fully ignore. And then the argument begins, and the argument is always about the witness. Were they drunk? Were they lying? Were they lonely or bored or desperate for attention? Were they simply mistaken, their eyes turning a black bear on its hind legs into something taller and stranger in the failing light? Every single conversation about this subject collapses eventually into a conversation about the reliability of one frightened human being standing alone in the trees. And that, the researchers realized, was the wrong unit of measurement. One witness proves nothing. But the researchers were not interested in one witness. They were interested in something a single person can never see, the shape of all of them together. 10,000 reports do not lie the way one report can lie. A liar can invent a monster. A liar cannot easily invent the exact same monster in the exact same kind of place at the exact same time of year as 10,000 strangers who never met and never spoke, across 6 decades and a continent. If the reports were pure fantasy, if this were nothing but folklore feeding on itself, then the archive should look like static. Random dots, chaos with no organizing principle behind it. So the team assembled the archive. And the scale of it is the first thing worth sitting with, because scale is the closest thing this field has to rigor. The data set they compiled drew from public sighting databases maintained across decades. It drew from newspaper archives dating back to the mid-20th century, digitized and searched line by line. It drew from county records, from ranger station logbooks, from the kind of quiet incident reports that get filed and forgotten. Some entries were a single sentence, some ran for pages. They spanned from the northern forest down through the southern swamps, from coastal rainforest to high desert scrubland, and they covered the full span from 1958 to the present day. Tens of thousands of individual accounts, stripped of names, stripped of drama, reduced to their bones. A location, a date, a time of day, a terrain type, a description. That reduction was deliberate, and it is important. The researchers did not want the machine reading the stories. Stories are contagious. Stories borrow from each other, from movies, from the shape of the legend as it already exists in the culture. What they wanted was the skeleton underneath the story, the coordinates and the calendar. Where, when, in what kind of place. Because if there is nothing here but human imagination, the imagination should be spread evenly across the map wherever imaginative, frightened people happen to be. And if there is something more than imagination, then the where and the when should betray it. The data should cluster. The data should have edges. They chose an artificial intelligence for the analysis precisely because of what it lacks. A human analyst, no matter how disciplined, arrives with a thumb on the scale. The believer sees confirmation in every dot. The skeptic sees error in every dot. Both of them are, in a sense, arguing with the campfire in their own memory. The machine has no campfire. It was not raised on the footage from the Birch hillside. It has no career riding on the answer, no book to sell, no forum reputation to defend. It was given the numbers and a single blunt instruction: find structure, or tell us honestly that there is none. It was, in the truest sense available to the subject, a witness that could not want the answer to come out one way or the other. And here is the part the team was most prepared for, the outcome they genuinely expected. They expected the machine to come back and report that the archive was noise, that the sightings track nothing but population and paranoia, that people report strange things wherever there are lots of people to report them, near roads because that is where humans travel, near towns because that is where humans live. They expected the pattern, if you could even call it that, to simply be a map of us, a map of where human beings go, how far they wander, and how easily a tired mind turns a shadow into a shape with shoulders. That is the honest, deflating explanation, and every serious person on the team assumed the data would land there. They had, in fact, already begun drafting the language for it. A negative result. A quiet, respectable nothing. That is not what it found. The machine did not return noise. It returned a structure so consistent, so repeating, so indifferent to the passing of decades and the changing of technology and the churn of the human beings doing the reporting, that the team stopped, ran it again, and then ran it a third time on a different slice of the data to make sure they were not looking at their own error reflected back at them. The pattern held. It held every time. And the more they refined the question, the sharper the pattern became, not blurrier, the way a false signal dissolves under scrutiny, but sharper, the way a real edge does when you finally bring it into focus. To understand what unsettled them, you have to understand what a false signal does when you press on it. A false signal is soft. It smears. You slice the data one way, and it appears. You slice it another way, and it thins to nothing. It is the ghost in the machine, an artifact of how you happen to ask the question. The team knew this behavior intimately because they had spent years watching promising anomalies dissolve into it. So when the first result came back with an edge to it, their instinct was not excitement. It was suspicion. They assumed they had made the pattern themselves, the way a person staring at wallpaper long enough will assemble faces out of the print. They went hunting for their own mistake. They could not find it. The first thing the machine reported was geography, and geography is where a lazy analysis usually reveals itself. If the sightings were only a map of population, the densest clusters would sit on top of the densest cities, the way spilled ink pools at the lowest point. They did not. The clusters formed along a very particular kind of terrain, the ragged seam where deep, unbroken forest meets the first thin edge of human traffic. Not the heart of the wilderness where almost no one goes and therefore almost no one could report anything. And not the town center where a million eyes would guarantee a flood of reports if reports were only a function of eyes. The signal lived in the margin between the two, the transition zone, the place a thing would go if it wanted to watch us without being seen, and the place a person would be if they were about to stumble into something that did not expect them. The team argued about this for days because there is an obvious counter and they raised it themselves before anyone else could. Of course, reports cluster at the forest edge. That is simply where a person on a trail or a back road has the wilderness in view. You cannot see a shape in the trees from a downtown intersection. The edge is where seeing becomes possible. That explanation is clean and it is reasonable, and the machine had already accounted for it. Because the clustering was not merely at the edge of forests. It was concentrated at specific edges, along specific corridors, drainages, and ridge lines and river valleys that connected one dense woodland to another, and it thinned out dramatically along other edges that were, by every measure of human access, identical. Same road density, same trail traffic, same population within a day's drive. If the signal were only about where people could see, those matched edges should have produced matched reports. They did not. Something was selecting certain corridors and ignoring others, and it was not the humans. The humans were spread the same on both. That was the geography. Then the machine turned to time, and time is where the whole thing tilted from strange into something the team did not have a comfortable word for. Because a legend, if it is only a legend, should not keep a schedule. Stories drift. They spike when a movie comes out, when a famous piece of footage circulates, when a television special reminds a country that it is afraid of the woods. That kind of pattern is easy to spot and easy to dismiss. It is a pattern in media, not in the world. The team fully expected the temporal data to be a mirror of pop culture, a graph of when people were reminded to be scared. And there was some of that. The machine could see the spikes that followed the famous moments, the small floods of reports that trailed every documentary and every viral clip. It flagged them, weighted them, and set them aside as exactly what they appeared to be: human attention, nothing more. Underneath that noise, though, once the cultural spikes were subtracted out, there was something the culture could not explain. A rhythm, a seasonal regularity that did not track when people were reminded to look, but when the woods themselves changed. The reports clustered into narrow windows tied to the turning of the year, the weeks when the mast crop fell and the deer moved, the weeks when the high country emptied of forage and something large, if something large existed, would be forced down toward the lower ground where the human margin waited. The reporting did not follow the calendar of human fear. It followed the calendar of an animal under pressure to move. And it did this decade after decade, in years when no film had come out, in years when no one was talking about the subject at all, in the quiet stretches when the legend was dormant in the public mind, and there was, by rights, no reason for the reports to cluster at all. They ran it again. They stripped out more. They fed the machine only the reports from the deadest years, the years when the phenomenon was culturally invisible, when a person who claimed to have seen something would have been laughed out of their own kitchen. Those years should have been pure noise, if anything was, with too few reports, too little attention, and no story to shape the perception. Instead, the pattern in those years was cleaner than in the loud ones. With the cultural spikes gone, with the copycats and the attention seekers and the fresh from the theater imaginations removed, what remained was a smaller, harder, more disciplined signal. The same corridors, the same seasonal windows, the same terrain margin. As if you had turned down the noise and heard more clearly than before, a low tone that had been playing underneath it the whole time. This is the moment the machine's neutrality stopped being a talking point and became the only thing holding the team steady. Because every human in that room could feel the pull of the conclusion, and every human distrusted the pull. It would have been so easy to want this. It would have been so satisfying to declare that the woods were hiding something and the data had finally caught it. But the machine did not want anything. It had no thrill running up its spine when the seasonal windows lined up. It simply reported that the structure was there, that it was stable across the widest slices and the narrowest ones, that it survived the removal of the obvious contaminants, and that it did not behave like a story. Stories decay. This did not decay. Under pressure, it sharpened. And so they widened the elimination pass. If the pattern was real, then the ordinary explanations had to be walked up to it one by one and tested against it, not waved away and not embraced, but measured. The team assembled every mundane answer that had ever been offered for the phenomenon, the whole tired lineup that skeptics reach for and believers resent, and they began feeding each one to the machine as a hypothesis, not to prove the legend. To try, in good faith, to kill it. Because a pattern that cannot survive an honest attempt to explain it away is not a discovery. It is a mistake wearing a discovery's clothes. So they started with the most obvious suspect of all, the one that has dissolved 1,000 sightings before this one, and asked the machine a simple question. Could this entire structure be nothing more than people mistaking a very ordinary animal for a legendary one? The machine took the misidentification hypothesis seriously because it was the strongest one. Across the entire archive, the most common explanation offered for the phenomenon was the black bear standing on its hind legs, backlit at dusk, its proportions distorted by fear and distance. It is a good explanation. It has closed more cases than any other. A bear rearing to sniff the air can look startlingly upright, startlingly tall, startlingly wrong. So the team fed the machine every known parameter of bear distribution, the range maps, the population densities, the elevation preferences, the denning behavior, the seasonal movement tied to food. If the reports were really bears, then the reports should sit on top of the bears. The geography should match. The clustering should trace the black bear's own map. It did not. And this was the first place the ordinary explanation broke against the pattern rather than dissolving it. A significant share of the tightest clusters, the corridors that had refused to decay through every filter, fell in regions where bear density was low, or where bears were functionally absent. Places with the wrong forest, the wrong elevation, the wrong food. The machine laid the two maps over each other, and the overlap was partial at best, enough to explain some of the reports, nowhere near enough to explain the structure. And there was a subtler mismatch buried in the timing. Bear's den. In the coldest heart of winter across most of their range, they go quiet, they go underground, they stop moving. If the reports were bears, the winter windows should have gone silent with them. But the pattern had a stubborn thread of cold weather sightings, deep snow sightings, reports from the exact weeks when a bear should have been asleep. The animal that was supposed to explain the phenomenon was, in too many places in too many months, simply not there to explain it. So the machine set the bear aside, not because it was wrong, but because it was insufficient. It could account for a slice and no more. The residue remained. And the team moved to the second suspect, the human one, the explanation that says the pattern is not about any animal at all, but about us, about where people go, where people live, where people drive at night with headlights sweeping the tree line, where people camp and hike and hunt and then come home with a story. This is the sharpest version of the skeptical case, and the machine was built to feel its force. A sighting requires a witness. A witness requires a person in the woods with a reason to look. So the report should cluster wherever human activity brushes up against wild land, near trailheads, near campgrounds, near the rural roads that thread through forest at the hours when people are tired and the light is bad. Of course, the pattern would trace population and access. That is not a monster. That is a map of human eyeballs. And the machine agreed, up to a point that turned out to be devastating for the tidiness of the argument. Yes, the reports lean toward the edges of human activity, Of course they did. A report cannot exist where no one is present to make it. But when the team corrected for that, when they weighted the entire archive against population density and road access and the sheer number of people moving through each area, the pattern did not flatten into a simple portrait of human traffic. It kept its shape. There were high traffic corridors that should have been thick with reports and were strangely thin. There were remote margins with almost no one passing through that produced clusters far denser than their foot traffic could justify. The signal did not scale with people the way pure misperception should. If every report were nothing but a tired human brain painting a shadow into a shape, then more humans should mean proportionally more shapes. Instead, the phenomenon concentrated where the human presence was low, but the terrain was specific. That same maddening margin between deep cover and open ground, that same elevation band, that same seasonal hinge. The machine noted this without alarm because the machine felt no alarm. It simply recorded that the human activity explanation, like the bear, accounted for part of the structure and left a residue it could not touch. And the residue was not shrinking as the explanations piled up. It was becoming more defined. Each ordinary answer peeled away the part of the pattern it could claim, and what stayed behind grew sharper, like a photograph developing in reverse, the noise lifting off, the figure underneath refusing to go with it. Then came the third suspect, and it was the one the team expected to do the most damage because it had no fur and no legs and could not be checked against a range map. Hoaxes, deliberate fabrication. The cast footprints, the costume in the tree line, the friend of a friend who admitted years later that it had all been a prank with plywood feet and a rented suit. If enough people had lied and if others had honestly repeated the lies, the pattern could be nothing more than a folklore artifact, a structure in the reports that reflected how stories spread, not anything in the woods. The machine took this seriously too, and here it had a tool the skeptics rarely get to use. A hoax has a signature. Fabrication clusters around fame, around the sites that got written up, the locations that drew film crews, the spots where a prank would find an audience. Real hoaxes chase attention because attention is the entire point. So the machine looked for the fingerprint of fame in the geography of the pattern, and it found some of it exactly where it should be, a bright ring of reports around the handful of famous sites, the ones everyone can name, the pilgrimage clusters that behaved precisely like folklore behaves. But the core corridors, the disciplined ones that had survived every filter, sat far from the famous places. They sat in unremarkable stretches of forest that no film crew ever visited, that no one was trying to make famous, that offered a hoaxer no audience and no reward. And they had been producing reports before the phenomenon had a name to hoax, before there was a legend to imitate, back in the dead years when a fabricated sighting would have earned nothing but ridicule. A hoax needs a story to hang on. In the years before the story existed, the pattern already did. One by one, the ordinary explanations walked up to the pattern, and one by one they came away carrying a piece of it and leaving the rest untouched. The bear took its share. Human traffic took its share. Hoaxes took a bright, obvious ring and nothing from the core. And still the residue stood, smaller now but harder, more specific, more resistant than when the elimination pass began. This is the opposite of what should happen. When you subtract explanations from a phantom, the phantom vanishes. When you subtract them from this, what remained refused to vanish, and the machine, which did not believe in legends and did not want the woods to be hiding anything, kept reporting the same flat fact: the structure persists. And so the team turned to the last and most uncomfortable possibility on the list, the one that had nothing to do with bears or costumes or the crowded corridors of human travel. What if the reports were real observations of something real, but the something was ordinary and misread? A person, a stump at dusk, a moose standing in tall grass at the exact angle that turns a familiar shape into a strange one. Misidentification is the quiet giant of this field, the explanation that accounts for more sightings than every hoax and every bear combined, and the machine gave it the widest berth of all because a misidentified thing still leaves a real footprint in the data. Someone genuinely saw something, they just named it wrong. But misidentification has a signature too, and the signature is randomness. If people are mistaking mundane things for a monster, those mistakes should scatter wherever the mundane things are, wherever there are stumps and shadows and elk and hikers with tired eyes, which is to say, almost everywhere. Misidentification should smear the pattern flat. It should fill in the empty forest as densely as the corridors, because ordinary things that fool the eye are not choosy about geography. And that is not what the data showed. The corridors stayed sharp. The empty forest stayed empty. The mistakes, if they were mistakes, were being made in the same narrow places, at the same hours, in the same seasons, year after year, decade after decade. And a mistake that repeats with that kind of discipline stops behaving like a mistake. It starts behaving like a response to something that is actually there. So the machine did the only honest thing left. It stopped trying to make the pattern disappear and started describing exactly what it was that would not disappear. And this is the part the team returned to again and again, the residue that survived the bear and the highways and the hoaxes and the tired eyes, a set of narrow forest corridors repeating across more than 6 decades, clustered by season and by hour with a regularity too tight to be folklore and too specific to be noise, sitting far from the famous places, appearing before the legend existed, and holding their shape across 60 years of changing cameras, changing witnesses, changing culture. The people reporting had almost nothing in common. The reports did. That is the finding. Not a creature, a pattern, stubborn, geographic, temporal, and real in the only sense the machine can measure, which is that it is there in the data and it will not go away no matter how hard you push on it. And here is where honesty has to do its hardest work, because it would be easy, it would be so easy to let the momentum of the elimination pass carry the story one step further than the data can go. The machine proved that the pattern is real. It did not. It cannot prove what is generating it. Every eliminated explanation narrows the field. Not one of them names the thing at the center. A pattern in reports is a pattern in human observation, in where people go, what they fear, what they are primed to see, and what in certain quiet corridors they keep reporting seeing. The clustering is genuine. The regularity is genuine. The residue is genuine. But between a real pattern and a real animal, there is a gap the algorithm never crossed, because the algorithm is not built to cross it. It analyzed decades of human records and found a shape in them. What casts the shape is the one question the data cannot answer, and the machine, to its credit, never pretended otherwise. Which brings the whole thing to the present and to the strangest wrinkle of all. The pattern is not fading. Everyone assumed it would. The reasonable expectation was that the modern world, floodlit, mapped to the meter, carried in every pocket as a camera that is always on, would starve the phenomenon out. A legend cannot hide from 4 billion lenses. And yet the reports are not declining. By the machine's count, more sightings are being logged now than in almost any decade of the record, filed by people who did not grow up on the legend, entering the same corridors at the same hours, in the same seasons, describing the same thing their grandparents described from stretches of forest their grandparents never visited. The pattern that should have died in the age of the smartphone is instead the most active it has ever been. Whatever the corridors are answering to, the answer did not stop when we started watching. That is the finding the machine handed back. Not a body, not a face in the tree line. a structure 66 years wide, sharpened by every attempt to erase it, still growing, and a hole in the middle where the cause should be. The team fed it every report they could find precisely because a machine does not want the woods to be hiding anything. It has no legend to protect, no expedition to fund, no book to sell, no childhood memory of a shape at the edge of a campground. It was built to find noise and call it noise. It found a pattern instead, and it kept finding it. And every filter that was supposed to dissolve the pattern only carved it into something harder. That is not proof of a creature. It is something quieter and, in its way, harder to dismiss. Proof that the pattern is real, whatever the pattern turns out to be. So the question comes back to you, the way it always does in these woods, because the machine has done everything a machine can do, and the last step is not a calculation. It is a judgment. You have watched the ordinary explanations walk up one at a time, and each carry away a piece, and none of them carry away the whole. You have seen the empty forests stay empty and the corridors stay sharp across 60 years of people who never met. When you hold that in your mind, what do you actually see? Do you see a folklore artifact, a self-reinforcing story that trained generations of nervous eyes to turn stumps and shadows into the same monster in the same handful of places, a pattern that lives entirely in the wiring of human expectation? Or do you see the outline of something that has always been in those corridors, something the reports have been circling for 6 decades without ever quite catching, a shape the machine can measure but cannot name? Tell me exactly where you land in the comments and be specific, because this is the part that decides everything. Is the residue that survived the elimination pass noise that a frightened mind carved into a creature, or a pattern that is really there, answering to something the data can see the edge of but never the center? Say which and say why. And if this is the kind of question that keeps you up a little longer than it should, subscribe, because the next dataset the machine has been fed is stranger than this one. The readings do not come from the forest at all, and the pattern it found there is one nobody wanted to confirm.